Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's delightful to see you on this absolutely beautiful day. Welcome to the John Carter Brown Library. Took a little bit of getting in, right? So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Wolf, and I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and I'm so glad to welcome you to this joint event with Brown's History Department, a celebration for Lynn Fisher's new book, Stealing America, The Hidden Story of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History, published by W.W. Norton. We are so delighted to have you with us, both here in the Macmillan Reading Room and online. Hybrid programming is a key piece of our commitment to welcoming people from around the world to the JCB and to accessibility. As a library focused entirely on the Americas from the 15th through the 19th centuries, we're both a world-leading collection and research institute, but also very fundamentally a library of colonialism, with a sense of commitment to this history and to advancing research and scholarship to explicate it. So, my first task today is to introduce you to the star of the show. It is such a pleasure to introduce Lynn Fisher, very soon to be professor of history, and the faculty director of the Center for Digital Scholarship at Brown. Lynn is the author of The Indian Great Awakening, Religion and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America, the co-author of Decoding Roger Williams, The Lost Essay of Rhode Island's Founding Father, and co-author of Reading Roger Williams, Rogue Puritans, Indigenous Nations, and the Founding of America, A Documentary History. He's also the founder and principal investigator of the Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas Project, which is a tribal community-centered collaborative project that seeks to create a public, centralized database of Native slavery throughout the Americas and across time. And of course, as I said, we're here to celebrate his new book, A History of Native American Enslavement and Dispossession in the British Colonies and then the United States over more than 6 centuries, Stealing America. I also just want to take a moment to note how important Lynn has been to the community, the intellectual community in particular here at the JCB. Lynn was the JCB's first Brown Faculty Fellow in 2022-23 when he brought the Brown Graduate Early American, now Early Americas, graduate group, graduate seminar here to the JCB, which started meeting then in the fall of 2022 and goes up until this very day, literally today, right before we gathered here in the reading room. The seminar was meeting downstairs. He has hosted the after-seminar meeting with food and beverage in a practice typical of his generous impulse to bring folks together. So I'm so delighted to celebrate Lynn and his work today, especially at the JCB.
Everyone, really nice to see you. Thanks so much to Karen and a warm introduction to the JCB and the Brown History Department for funding, very importantly, funding this event. And also thanks to you for being here, and especially those who waited outside in the stairs. I do apologize, but I'm glad that most people made it in. It's a beautiful day. I know you had a choice. Thanks for being inside this room with me and with all of us. I want to, as you might imagine, talk about this book, Stealing America, which is coming out on Tuesday this coming week. It's available for pre-order, but also the kind folks from Symposium are about here selling copies as well. But before that, I have some people I want to thank, I need to thank. As I look out over this assembled beautiful audience here, I think of all the different ways people in this room have contributed to this project. My name is on the cover, and they wouldn't let me put all yours on. They just said it would be too messy. But honestly, no book is written by one person, right? Not really anyway. So with that, let me just try to quickly offer a few thanks. I want to start with my Live editor, Bob Weil, who's here tonight. Bob, you should raise your hands. Really appreciate your catching the vision for this book and believing in this and doing such a thorough editing job. Everything that's not right about this book, I claim full responsibility for, I'm sure, but I really appreciate the work that you put into this. The cover of the book features the artwork of Silver Moon LaRose, who's a wonderful Narragansett artist. As a fundraiser for the Atomic Clock, we're actually selling prints of this, which are available over there afterwards, and all proceeds do go to the Atomic Clock, which is a museum here in Rhode Island, and we want to support them as well. I want to also mention another special group of people who patiently shaped my thinking on all these different kinds of issues, and they are the tribal representatives and CDS collaborators, and also a lot of other students involved in the process too, of the Stolen Relations Project, which kind of is separate but intermingled with this book in different kinds of ways. And the conversations we had with the tribal representatives for Stolen Relations clearly left a deep imprint on this book and its sort of production and the way it's framed, the kind of terminologies. And I just want to thank them for their kindness and patience in working with me, and I hope that what the book has become is honoring to the trust that you put in me with the information and knowledge. Also want to recognize Tall Oak Whedon, who was a part of the OG Stolen Relations tribal representatives back in 2019, who has since passed away. Tall Oak was one of these people who I first got to know in grad school in 2005, back in the Middle Ages or something like that. And he was always this incredible presence and firebrand who was unwilling to let people be comfortable in their understanding of this history. And he really, really shaped my work. And he would just be everywhere. I was in Bermuda on a research trip, and who walks in the door? Tall Oak Whedon, right? And instead of researching, we both just chatted for half the day, which is really cool. And actually, it wasn't just me. Everyone around him in the archives just kind of sat and listened. It was really amazing. One of the pleasures of being at Brown, of course, is the students. And I'm so grateful for students in my classes, some of whom are here, who read portions of this book. But I also want to give a shout out to Charlotte Crozier, who is here as well, who, if you need someone to help you wrap up the details of a book as you're finishing up, image permissions and map information and footnote fact-checking, you have one more year to hire her before she heads off into greener pastures. But honestly, it was really such an amazing help at the end. And then finally, this is going to be so embarrassing for them, but my family, who basically, my kids grew up with this book and started, some of them, Harrison the youngest, was 2 years old when I started this process, and he's now 17. So it gives you a sense of how one measures how long it takes to write a book sometimes through the people. All right, I also want to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Narragansett Nation and just want to recognize their stewardship of these lands for generations and want to do our best to honor them and remain committed to ongoing justice today. All right, so to the book. In this book, I try to explore and understand the long history of stealing both Native people and Native lands, centered on English spaces, so English-speaking spaces, so English colonies, as well as the United States. And as I explained in the book's title, in the book's introduction, the title was inspired by these cartouches of these early modern maps, right, where you have an indigenous person, often a woman, kind of surrounded with the goods of the Americas, and then the sort of map off to the side. And it strikes me that this was sort of an embodiment of America, representing both the people and the land. So for better or for worse, that's kind of what I went with. Stealing America in this book is stealing both the indigenous people and the land, something we see from the opening moments of European invasion. This book had its origins in the archive, as I was a graduate student trying to find evidence of indigenous people who had joined local churches during the First Great Awakening. That book eventually became the Indian Great Awakening. But I noticed something that puzzled me. It wouldn't have puzzled some people in the archive, but it did me, which is there were indigenous people who were listed as servants and slaves in the 1730s, 1740s. And I didn't really have a register for that at the time. It seemed quite late in New England, and so I sort of puzzled over it for a few hours and set it aside and thought I would come back to it, which I did in 2011, as the first book was in press. And as I began to follow some research leads, actually I had gotten a fellowship to go to the Caribbean, highly recommend, 10 out of 10 by the way, and went to Bermuda trying to find some of these connections to New England. And that just set the book on a whole different course. I began to just find more and more stuff, both in New England, down the East Coast, out into the Caribbean, Bermuda, Jamaica, Barbados, all those places that the English had been. And the project initially was going to end with the Revolutionary War, but I kept on finding additional things, eventually moved into sort of antebellum America, following colonization out west. And then after I thought I was done, I was talking with some people, and they're like, boarding schools might be a good thing to look into. And they were exactly right, and so expanded. The last 2 chapters are on boarding schools, and then 20th century adoptions, which I'll explain in a second, do fit together more than it might seem. So in a way, this book is simultaneously Atlantic and continental, trying to pull together different pieces. So just a few pieces of larger context, just sort of a state of the field in terms of the number or sort of prevalence of this. Not that numbers are really matter that much, but there has been a lot of attention from academics on this topic over the past 20, 25 years, I don't know. It hasn't taken root so much in sort of wider consciousness, I don't think. Everywhere I've been speaking, people are like, I had no idea. And I'm like, well, there's been books out for 25 years, but maybe this one will be the one that changes it. I doubt it. But the numbers are actually quite striking. So those of us who are working on this have estimated, this is really building off of Andres Resendez's estimates in The Other Slavery, around 5.5 million indigenous people in the Americas as a whole between 1492 and 1880 were enslaved or ensnared in slavery in some way. Every European power, every English colony, virtually every American state at some point coerced native labor and sold their lands. And also, it's important to think about the numbers in terms of North America specifically. So again, building on some prior estimates, I'm estimating that around 600,000 indigenous people in North America alone were enslaved. This is really striking because if you use the numbers in the slavevoyages.org database, both for shipments directly from West Africa as well as those shipped from the Caribbean, it's roughly around the same number. So in this same time period, you have a rough equivalency of indigenous people enslaved and also trafficked from different, and Africans trafficked from different parts of either West Africa or the Caribbean. So it really is a big part of, I think, American history and deserves to be told. I was trying to tell the story within one book of sort of the English colonies in the United States, which no one has quite done in this way before. I also want to recognize that this history is first and foremost known and processed by Native communities themselves. And as a non-Native scholar, I've been really grateful for the opportunities to be in conversation with tribal partners and members about this and collaborators. And I want to read a sentence or two from Dawn Dove's introduction to the Narragansett section in this wonderful anthology, Dawnland Voices. Is Dawn here tonight? I thought I saw her name on the list. But anyway, she is just a wonderful Narragansett elder. And she, too, speaks of these different kinds of historical realities. So she says, "The historical trauma that my people suffer is great. We did not inflict this upon ourselves. This is the direct result of the theft of our land, the enslavement and indenture of my people by the colonizers. As a child, I was always told that we have relatives in Bermuda as a result of the enslavement of our people by the colonizers. This historical trauma lives in the hearts and minds of the Narragansett today. As we walk on our God-given homeland, we can see how the colonizers, through their greed and corruption, have stolen our birthright." With this powerful quote lingering on our minds, let me outline 5 different threads that I was trying to tease out in the book, and I'll give an example for each one of them. Throughout, I was trying to, I utilized, it's done, I can't change it. Utilize the language of stealing to reflect Native community-centered experiences of this history. So one of the important reorientations I think I tried to do in the book is an expansion in our way we conceptualize slavery beyond sort of economics and labor history, although that's important as well, to think about Native communities who experience enslavement first and foremost as a community lost, as a stealing away of their loved ones. So there's many examples of this in the book, but I'll just mention one, who was Peter Freeman. He was an Narragansett man who served for the English as a soldier and a spy in King Philip's War, this cataclysmic war, also called the War for New England, here in New England in the 1670s. And so he goes off, he serves the English forces for a year, essentially, and comes back only to find that his wife and daughter had been stolen while he was away serving by English soldiers. So he was able to get his wife back, but after 10 years of petitioning, the daughter could not be returned, and all the Freemans got for their loss was 2 coats, 2 pairs of stockings, and 2 pairs of shoes. And this idea of sort of the loss that is inflicted on families and communities seems quite striking. I also think that stealing actually opened up a not lovely, that's the wrong word, an important, a helpful, a conceptual space. It's quite capacious in terms of the kinds of things that we might put into that category. So not just chattel slavery, but including that, but also indenture, kidnapping, capture, forced boarding school attendance. These all seem to fit into that sort of rubric of stealing. And I just want to affirm, too, not all Native people were stolen, to be sure, but every community, I would say, most communities in North America, and I think elsewhere, too, experience some version of stealing people and also likely stealing land. So a second thread in this book is that stealing people and land are connected, which I call sort of a double benefit from enslavers' perspectives of this dual stealing of Native people and land. So when you steal a Native person and enslave them, you contribute to the labor force, but also you destabilize communities, making it easier to actually take more land. And I think this is maybe one of the key differences between Indigenous slavery and African slavery, and I'd be happy to chat about this, of course, but at least thinking about North American practices here. It seems quite different when you want to enslave people who are living on land that you also want. That seems quite powerful, actually. And so that sort of strategy of enslavement to also get land is important. We see these interrelationships in every war against Native people. I won't list them all off, but any war you can think of, this is probably happening in the colonial period, Revolutionary War, even beyond, many times as well. And just one example of this is in what scholars have called the Carolina Indigenous slave trade that operated out of the Southeast for about 40 or 50 years. Out of the Carolinas primarily, that ensnared up to 51,000 natives. These are building on the numbers of Alain Gallet. And I was struck going through some of these records by the experience of the Tuscaroras, who sort of, not to get into all the details, but sort of had been sided with the English, and then the English turned on them in a way, which happened repeatedly for different nations. And the Tuscaroras are experiencing slave raids, and so they go to Pennsylvania with 8 wampum belts, and they petition the Pennsylvania leaders to allow them to move and take them in. And they offer 8 wampum belts, one after the other. Most of them are related to enslavement, but the second one really stuck out to me. They say the second belt was sent from their children born and those yet in the womb, requesting that room to sport and play without danger of slavery might be allowed to them. So again, thinking about the impact on communities, but in this case, the request fell on deaf ears. Tuscaroras returned to North Carolina. A huge war breaks out, the Tuscarora War. It leads to hundreds of Tuscaroras being enslaved and sent off into different parts of the Caribbean. And then eventually in the Yamasee War a few years later, after the Yamasee War, Tuscaroras end up moving to what is now New York and the Haudenosaunee and become the 6th member of the Confederacy, thereby vacating the lands in the Carolinas. So the slave trade in general massively disrupted communities and leads very directly to sort of colonizers moving in and setting up new plantations and claiming new land and so forth. And it's not just in the Southeast. These processes happened all over the place. Thirdly, and relatedly, I guess in a way, there's a repeated targeting of Native women and children throughout this history. And we see this in many wars when Indigenous men were executed or shipped abroad while Native women and children were retained locally and forced into slavery. We also see this as Americans colonized westward into places like New Mexico and Utah and Colorado and California, and brought with them and also capitalized pre-existing forms of servitude and slavery. And significantly, California, just as one example, there's lots of them, admitted as a free state in 1850, right? But sort of categorized the kind of unfreedom that they were imposing on indigenous people. So it wasn't really part of the national conversation about slavery at the time. Admitted as a free state and passed two different indenture laws in 1850 and 1860. The second one was even more draconian, but basically both of them allowed sort of Californians to grab Native children, take them before a justice of peace, and have them assigned to them. And we can see these newspaper ads that just list out the names of these indigenous children and the years they have to serve. And there's other processes and other situations we know that the likelihood of being freed when it's listed that you should be free at this time period is pretty low for all kinds of reasons. And I just have highlighted here this one girl, Laura, indentured at the age of 10 to serve until the age of 25. And there's lots of other examples that we could talk about too, but that's just one. Fourth, this history has been hidden through the denial of Native presence in the archives. This is another thread I'm trying to draw out here as well. So this is the hidden part of the title of the book. I was doing a podcast interview and the person said, so when I saw your book title, I'm like, this isn't hidden history. We know this history. And then he said, but then I read your book and I'm like, okay, it's hidden. So I'm like, all right, thumbs up. One person over. But I do think there's a sense in which this history has been hidden and has been erased. And that feels really important to highlight here. The late Narragansett scholar Ella Sekatu has called this documentary genocide through racial shifting from sort of indigenous to just slave or quote unquote Negro or black or whatever in the archives. One example of this, it's not the only by far, but a really striking one I found early on in the process was census from Bermuda from 1698. And as you can see, it's very clear. There's two columns, white and black. And if you were looking at this, you would say, cool, no indigenous slavery here, right? But when you get into the nitty-gritty of the probate records, suddenly you find a completely different story. And so for this one instance, for Boaz Sharp, just a couple of years later, his entire enslaved population is indigenous. And other people who have looked a lot at probate records have estimated that maybe up to a fifth of the, 20% of the enslaved population is indigenous. So something that this kind of official census completely obscures and hides. There's other things too that are related to this. I try to highlight the way in which race was leveraged to benefit colonizers and enslavers. And just the racial logics of the time period are so sort of, as you would expect, imbalanced and unequal. One drop of African blood, the so-called one drop rule sort of dictates that anyone who has one drop of African blood, if we don't believe in blood quantums, this is something that was operationalized in the time period, made them black, but this was not true for natives and actually the opposite entirely. Natives needed to have 100% native blood to be considered authentic. And so you find a lot of recategorizing of mixed race, multiracial indigenous people throughout this whole period up until the present for sure. Lots of examples of this, as when North Carolina decreed in 1715 that all enslaved people who are not entirely Indian shall be deemed a quote unquote Negro. I mean, that's quite a striking sort of blanket recategorization in just one colony. The fifth, you'll be happy to know, and the final thread in this book is that it centers the actions of Native nations and individuals in asserting their sovereignty. This is not a story of colonial domination, and I want to just say thanks to Seth here too. In 2019, there was a really great book manuscript workshop, and a lot of people read it. Phil actually was one of the ones who read it. It was way too long and not a good book at all, but Seth really pushed me on this question of where are people doing things that we need to focus on. And there's lots of examples in this. Enslaved people ran away, tribal governments petitioned colonial governments, nations waged wars of resistance, enslaved people sued for their freedom. Native parents petitioned to get their children back. And there's so many examples of this in the book. I hope that this comes through. But just one of these to sort of bring it up into the 20th century is the powerful protest of Native nations, parents, families, individuals in the mid to late 20th century who, after centuries and centuries of unjust policies and stealing of children and separating of families and stealing of lands, capitalized on a cultural moment. This is sort of building on Red Power and aim to really get in front of Congress and to make a difference in terms of a federal policy. And one of the things that they were petitioning and talking about is the fact that 1/3 of Native children by 1960, 1/3 of Native children were in non-Native homes through boarding schools and adoptions, and really lined up to testify to Congress about these harms. And just one example is Calvin Isaac, who's a tribal chief of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw. And he said, if Indian communities continue to lose their children to the general society for adoptive and foster care at the alarming rates of the recent past, if Indian families continue to be disrespected and their parental capacities challenged by non-Indian social agencies as vigorously as they have been in the past, then education, the tribe, Indian culture have little meaning or value for the future. A powerful statement that led to substantial legislation, including the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which is in a way where the book ends, even though this is an ongoing present story. So let me just wrap up. There's so much more to say, but I guess you'll just have to buy the book. I don't know. But let me wrap up by saying that one of the things I wrestle with in this book is how this history has been hidden for so long. There's a lot of reasons. It's partially the erasures that I just talked about. I also kind of wonder if we just sort of suck at dealing with hard histories in the United States and have the inability to wrestle with them. And I think this sort of not wanting to deal with hard histories dates back to the very beginning of any kind of colonization process where things were spun in different ways. One example that stuck out to me was Thomas Jefferson, who was our future third president at the time, in the future, but not at the time. 1785, he is writing or publishing the Notes on the State of Virginia, an interesting book for all kinds of reasons, but he says an inhuman practice once prevailed in this country of making slaves of Indians. And I was so struck by the past tense and just sort of placing that in the English colonial past. And at the very same time, you have enslaved indigenous people self-emancipating and running away, and just no sense of that, no acknowledgement of that, I think is really striking. I will end just by recognizing too, because I end the book with this as well, by recognizing indigenous communities as powerful memory keepers for their own communities and for the nation. And this is a picture of a reconnection powwow from Bermuda, June 2018, that is an example of this, I think. And it is essentially people in Bermuda and New England reconnecting and reassembling connections that had been severed by colonialism when New England's ancestors had been shipped off to Bermuda as slaves. So these kinds of powerful reconnections and storytelling, I think, are some of the most inspiring things that I've found in this book process. So thank you very much.
We're so fortunate to have with us two interlocutors with Lynn's work, Paula Peters and Phil Deloria. I'm going to introduce both of them and then hand the podium over to Paula first. Paula Peters is a journalist, educator, and activist, a member of the Wampanoag tribe. She has spent most of her life in her tribal homeland of Mashpee, Massachusetts. The owner of Smoke Signals Communications and an independent scholar and writer of Native and particularly Wampanoag history. She's a producer of the traveling exhibit, Our Story, 400 Years of Wampanoag History. She also produced the Wampum Belt Project in search of the lost treasures of Metacom, including an effort to restore the art and tradition of wampum making among her people. She is the executive producer of the 2016 documentary film, Mashpee 9, and author of the companion book. And Phil Deloria is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University, where his research and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States, as well as the comparative and connective histories of indigenous peoples in a global context. He's the author or editor of a kind of gobsmacking volume of scholarship, beginning for many of us with his path-breaking Playing Indian from 1998, in which he traced the tradition of white Indian play from the Boston Tea Party to the New Age movement. His most recent book is Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, which reclaims a previously unknown Native artist while offering a new exploration of American Indian visual arts of the mid-20th century. I'm going to hand it over to Paula.
Waninakan, Natosui Sonkwaben, Nutamas Maspiak. That's my traditional introduction. Good evening to you all. My traditional name is Sonkwaben. It means cool wind, which I think we have had a little of, maybe too much. Sorry about that. I didn't know how much my remarks were going to follow yours so well, Lynn, but you'll see what I mean. I'm not the best speaker. I'm not a scholar, but sometimes I have interesting things to say. I was in second grade the first time I experienced erasure. The lesson was on Thanksgiving in the new Plymouth colony, and the teacher told the novel story of desperate, hungry pilgrims in a strange new world seeking religious freedom. And she said, they all would have died if not for the friendly Indians who taught them how to survive and how to plant food and fish and hunt. And upon the first harvest that they celebrated, they invited all the Indians to come and feast with them. I would grow to learn that there was a lot wrong with that story. But at that moment, my little heart was beating in my little chest because I was so excited and so proud because I knew that the people that she was talking about were my ancestors. She didn't say Wampanoag by name, but I knew this in my heart of hearts. But my pride was short-lived, and what happened next had a profound impact on what would become a lifelong mission for me. A boy raised his hand, and he asked the teacher, well, what happened to the Indians? And the teacher said, well, sadly, they all got a horrible plague and died. I raised my hand in that desperate way that kids do when they know the answer, or in this case, the truth. And I told her, no, that isn't true. It can't be true. The people who saved the pilgrims were the Wampanoag, and they didn't all die because I'm a Wampanoag and I am still here. That was 60 years ago, and since then, my life's work has been punctuated by that simple statement: we are still here. For more than 400 years, our story has been misinterpreted, obscured, and omitted in favor of a version of history that erases the embarrassing truth, the horrible, inhumane truths that Lynn was just talking about. When I first met Lynn Fisher, we were both engaged in a deep fascination with the story of the people of St. David's Island who knew that they were descended from indigenous slaves stolen from New England. I had actually been introduced to some of these folks many, many years earlier when my dad was the chairman of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe for many years, and people used to come and visit him and tell him stories. And there were people that came from Bermuda, and they said, we're your relatives, we know you are. And I was looking at Dad like, Dad, come on. These people came from an island somewhere out in the Atlantic. And he said, no, we need to listen. I was young then, but I did learn to listen. So these people that were descended from indigenous slaves that were stolen from New England, they knew that much about themselves. The people who were stolen were deemed a threat after Pequot's War and Metacom's rebellion, which is what I like to call it, you probably know it better as King Philip's War, but they were stolen from their ancestral homelands and delivered to a tropical island to work on plantations. This was a napping story of enslavement that Bermudians themselves would just have assumed stayed sleeping. Because I don't know about you, Lynn, but when I got there and I started asking questions, people would be like, "What are you talking about? We didn't have slaves here." They thought it was a big lie. But despite hundreds of years of removal, the natives of St. David's Island did not forget who they were. And we didn't forget them. We had been looking for them for 350 years. That they were found by me is not terribly surprising, but that they were not only found, but believed by Linford Fisher is a remarkable truth. Unlike my second grade teacher, Lynn saw a piece of history that was buried and needed to be exposed. He saw our truth and he heard our voices. His research took him around the world, following ship's routes to untold ports where my ancestors and the ancestors of so many indigenous people were sold like bottles of rum and meant to be forgotten like the last drop. Their vital records may have been removed, but Lynn recognized that they were human sons and daughters, and his work in this book defines them in that way. This book restores dignity to them and to people like me. We are still here, and our story is far more complex than a harvest feast that the Wampanoag were never actually invited to. This history shines a different light on William Bradford's gift of God, that remarkable English-speaking Indian Tisquantum who taught the Pilgrims how to survive. Tisquantum, who was himself a kidnapped and enslaved Wampanoag, had found his way home only a year before the Mayflower arrived in Plymouth, or Patuxet as it was called, to discover that his village was devastated by a plague. When those desperate colonists arrived, they found the same village, that village of Patuxet, where they swept away the bleached bones of Squanto's dead relatives to build their homes. And then they renamed it Plymouth. It's a story that would have made my second grade teacher's head spin. Squanto is one of very few indigenous slaves who had a name. For so many others who were once known, stealing America has restored them to significance. It is like me raising my hand much higher than ever before to say they were real people, they suffered true injustice, and despite it all, we are still here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Paula, for those beautiful words. And don't ever say, "Oh, I'm not a speaker," because you totally are. So I feel incredibly honored to join you all together today in celebrating the remarkable achievement that is Linford Fisher's book, Stealing America, The Hidden Story of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History. It is, I think, in many ways a monumental work, combining the broad vision of a synthesis with the precision of a research monograph, and told in a lyrical, powerful, but always historical voice. I consider myself fortunate to have participated in January 2019 in the manuscript workshop for this book that Lynn has already mentioned. Back then, Lynn was worried about how to reach a wider readership. In your framing letter, Lynn, which I went back and read, you said something to the effect that you feared the profession more than the fabled broader audience. And so the book was sometimes dense, technical, as you say, long, and maybe quietly a bit historiographical, right, in a way. And if I'm right about that, I didn't go back and read the entire manuscript from 2019. Although I do have to say, when I walked out of that manuscript, for the next years afterwards, I was like, every colonial war was a slave raid, because it was that thorough a documentation there. So if I'm right about this historiographical kind of bent or interest, it seems to me it made complete sense in that moment. And perhaps in our moment as well. On the one hand, there was an immediate problem, the problem of navigation, because Andreas Resendez's book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, had come out in 2016. And it was kind of everywhere, at that time. And you could see Lin figuring out how he might go about writing a different kind of book. And so the focus on the English Atlantic in particular, the stunning archival work in the Caribbean that took an Atlantic and British kind of focus, including my memory of you sort of regaling us with kind of Indiana Jones research stories about Providence Island and things like that. But there was a larger historiographical issue as well. I think for most Americans, and indeed for some, if not many historians, the story of slavery in the United States is the story of the South, of plantations and slave quarters and the Civil War, of slave markets and of cotton and tobacco and sugar, and if we're lucky, of networks and ties to the Caribbean and the global economy. It's a black and white story mostly, one that edges cautiously or incautiously sometimes into economic logics and often quite forthrightly into social questions about racial formation and cultural questions about the nature of the human. There is, of course, another story. Since Almond Wheeler Lauber's 1913 book, Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States, we titled books differently back in the day. Historians have been writing at least a little bit about Native enslavement, but doing so without putting any dents in the master narratives of American slavery and indeed American history, as I think Paula has just so eloquently reminded us. So what would one do with this list? Alan Galay's 2003 book, The Indian Slave Trade, winner of the Bancroft Prize. Christina Snyder's 2010, Slavery in Indian Country, winner of prizes from SHEAR, the WHA, and Berks. These are all professional organizations. Brent Rushforth's 2014, Bonds of Alliance, winner of the Organization of American Historians, Merle Curdy Award, and several others. Margaret Newell's 2015, Brethren by Nature, winner of the OAH Raleigh Prize, and of course Resendez's Other Slavery, winner of the Bancroft Prize, and named as a finalist for the National Book Award. I left lots of folks out, James Brooks, et cetera, et cetera. If you took Galay's book as an early foundation, it's worth noting then that this cluster appeared within about a 5-year window. And I mentioned their various prizes on purpose because these were highly visible books, a coherent and rangy body of scholarship that should have restructured the historiography of slavery and of American history writ large, but which I think largely failed to do so. So we hope that academic scholarship will make its way not only into our wider academic conversation, but also into curricula and to the common sense, right, of American sort of discourse. But we've now had a full decade since that cluster of books, and from my point of view, it really pretty much hasn't happened. So if I were to walk into most American schools this afternoon, or if I were to query a random person on the street about American slavery, it seems highly likely to me that indigenous people would not be part of that pool of knowledge. Now, we might blame this situation on the settler colonial imperative to attenuate, contain, control, forget, erase the ways that Native people are allowed to appear in our master narratives. I think that's true. We might think about our habit of thinking fast, with the sort of, where the familiar and the sort of easy takes precedence over the complex. I'm citing works about thought here that are floating around. But we might ask what one would do about it, right? And I think one answer is you keep writing books like this one, which have strongly supported scholarly specifics, which is to say that Linford Fisher brings the receipts, right, in this book. And at the same time, a broad synthetic view of American history, which is to say that you also tell the story, right? In Lin's 2019 framing, he observed that he started the project wanting to avoid the numbers question. But, he wrote, people keep asking me how my findings will change things, if at all, and the few readers I've had so far have been disappointed. Contrast that with the opening, I mean, there are many opening gambits, but I'll take this one that you find in the book today. Indigenous enslavement was a colossal phenomenon that spanned the entire Americas. In the area that later became the United States, as many as 600,000 Native Americans were enslaved during this period, with many more stolen from families into the 20th century through boarding schools, fostering, and adoption programs. In comparison, approximately 530,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to North America through 1865. These numbers reveal a shocking truth. American foremothers and forefathers enslaved Native Americans in roughly the same numbers as they imported enslaved Africans. Some of that language was actually in the 2019 draft, that last sentence, but now this language is bolder, more confident, more assertive, and I think more transformative than the text that I remember reading. So the other question that Lynn posed in 2019 centered on Native perspective. I was hoping, he wrote, that this book could describe and understand Indian slavery in a way that reflects Native experiences and sensibilities. And I think it was pretty cogent, pretty sort of it was your sensibility that you weren't quite getting there, right? And I think to understand something of how he came to answer these questions in the book, we have to acknowledge the importance of stolen relations, the extraordinary digital history project that is intimately tied to Stealing America, and Lynn has mentioned this. The project pulled together a quantitative database and modeled tribal collaboration at the same time, working with Dawnland tribal nations, even as it created then this wonderful platform to tell archival stories. It connected a bottom-up, accessible approach to research, including a body of citizen researchers, with Native history telling, with academic scholarship, with public education and outreach. In this book, Lynn asks us to expand our imagination when it comes to the labor-unfreedom nexus, to take seriously stealing, right? Indenture, convict labor, debt enslavement, reproduction, educational forced labor, adoption, all of these other things. So this expansion of concept is paralleled then by expansions of both spatiality and temporality, as so often happens, right? I think I'll expand my chronology, which means my space gets bigger. I think I'll think broader spatially, and then suddenly my chronology gets bigger as well. He reminds us that indigenous enslavement was the first form of slavery in the Americas, and as it extended beyond the 13th Amendment, was in a sense the last, the final classic form that then connects to the various unfreedoms that continue to haunt our present. These things then require, in turn, a further expansion, a wider vision, I think, of race and racial formation questions. As Blackness and enslavement came to function as dialectical embodiments of one another in the world of Atlantic racial capitalism, the enslaved indigenous person was likely to disappear into those categories, as Lynn has so wonderfully demonstrated for us today. But Lynn insists that instead we recognize the presence of multiracial indigenous people as both Black and Native, which leads him to this recalculation of the numbers that Andres Reséndez proposed in The Other Slavery. Andres's numbers were 2.5 to 5 million indigenous enslaved people in the Western Hemisphere, now increased in Lynn's calculation to 3 million to 6 million people. And we might ask why these numbers matter. But I think they do, and I think part of what matters about them is the ways in which your work also moves us away from sort of like the estimates of a hidden, right, or sort of into things which actually have a bit more sort of heft to them. In the American South in particular, Lynn estimates that we've overlooked the presence of between 80,000 and 200,000 enslaved Native and mixed race people. And that's in the South, right, the heart of the conversation about American slavery. So read this book for its narrative flow, its storytelling gifts, its temporal and chronological breadth, and you will be moved to say, a magisterial work of synthesis. But I encourage you, when you pick up the book, to follow the list of source abbreviations you'll find on pages 443 and 444. These testify to primary source research in the Caribbean, the UK, US federal records, US state records, as well as oral histories and interviews, and they will leave you instead saying, a fine-grained work of deep research and scholarly interpretations. It's one of the beautiful things, I think, about this book. I was talking with a friend last fall, someone serving on a book prize committee, like the ones that handed out all those earlier prizes to books about Native enslavement. And we both agreed that if one cared about winning prizes, which all pretend that we don't, but we kind of probably do, If we cared about winning book prizes, it would have been tough to be publishing in 2025 with Emily Connolly's vested interest in the pool, one of my very favorite books of this year. And maybe even worse in 2026, since you'd have to contend with Lynn Fisher's Stolen America. I hope it wins a lot of prizes, Lynn. So the linking, yeah, I know that sounded like a conclusion, but I got one more paragraph. It did. The linking together of the double theft of land and bodies feels to me, at least, like it does present this fabulous opportunity for us all to think again about the history of this continent and its peoples. And that this time around, we might imagine that the narrative could change. And if that proves to be the case, and I am hopeful, we can thank Lynn Fisher and his many collaborators and partners and point back to this book, Stealing America, The Hidden Story of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History, as a watershed moment. And then we can remember that we were all gathered here today to celebrate it. Congratulations, Lynn, on your achievement.
Lovely. Thank you. That definitely sounded like an ending there. You got to work on your end moment there, right? Okay, so Lynn and Paula and Phil are going to come up here, and Lynn is going to call on folks from the audience who have questions. We've got about 15 minutes for some conversation, and then we will open for refreshments, and we'll have a reception until about 7. Okay, so.
Thank you all for your really provocative statements and presentations. And I'm going to ask, I think, a provocative question and a pointed question, but it's meant in the spirit of applauding my colleague Linford Fisher for doing all this work and publishing this book, and for Don for your work, and for my old friend and colleague Vine Deloria for his work all these years. And the question I want to ask is, starts with Lynn's first slide. Well, I was so struck when you gave the numbers. When you said as many as 5.5 million Native peoples were enslaved, approximately equivalent to the same number of people from Africa who were brought to America enslaved, and you said 600,000 in North America. Then later on, you tried to explain why is it we don't know about this? And it's taken 2026 for us to find out. What's wrong with all of us historians and teachers, like the teacher you mentioned? So I want to say, Lynn, that I'm slightly dissatisfied with your explanation towards the end of erasure. Right? You said documentary genocide, which is a nice phrase. And then you said something that was quite interesting, the cultural forgetting of uncomfortable truths. So I want to ask all three of you, that cannot be the whole explanation of why we don't know about this history and why it has taken us so long to even talk about it and document it.
And
So
when you repeat that phrase, when you repeat that phrase today based on his book, no one still believes you. You can repeat it today or tomorrow, and the public will not believe what Lynn Fisher has produced in his book. There is still a huge disbelief that he's correct.
Well, that's why I'm asking, what do we have to do, and why has it
The
taken
public
so long?
doesn't believe it.
Well, don't be so pessimistic.
I deal with it every day.
I mean, we are educators, and we are, in the business of educating, and we want to make sure that
I got it twice this week.
buried again. And but I want to ask these three people, give us some more deeper understanding of why it is that this history has been erased or buried or culturally forgotten. Thank you.
Are you available for publicity? I mean, I'm happy to employ you. I don't know if this is on or not, but I thank you for the question. It's really, really important. I don't fully know. I explore some different possibilities in the epilogue. I'm not sure I fully get there. I think it's a bit of a mystery. I do think it has to do with sort of it comes back to sort of both the archives and sort of the way in which, unless you really push on them, they're going to reveal something that is not quite so complete. It's also, I think that I think historians are partially to blame too for believing the archives sometimes as well. I also think I'll say it again, American culture has done a certain kind of work, and Phil, of course, has written a lot about this, and I will let you speak in a second, but just has done a lot of work about this too. And so I try to trace in a way, not just sort of invisibilizing Indigenous people with regards to slavery, but just in regard to their existence. I think Paula's opening story was really quite striking in that way. And so sort of this invisibilizing of Native people throughout American history and even into the present as well. I mean, how many people in Rhode Island could tell you, like, or could lead you to the Narragansett Reservation, right, for example? It's really astonishing. It continues today in certain ways. And I think that we have defined, I don't know if this is right or not, but like I think Americans have limited capacity for dealing with their own complicity and past harm and trauma, and we have sort of decided that like the two things we can maybe handle are African slavery and maybe dispossession. And so we sort of slot these harms in certain ways, and it really takes a lot to move beyond those comfortable ways of reckoning with the past. Anyway, I don't really have an answer fully, but I would love to hear my co-speakers.
I don't know. Does this work? Both work.
Both? Okay.
All right, you can have that one. I think for us, for Indigenous people, we have always been raising our hand. We have always been responsible for telling our own story. And until it becomes the responsibility of academia and people like Lynn and Phil to put this story out there in terms that, you know, like you talked about all those little, what do you call them, footnotes, endnotes, whatever. You know, we don't have those in Indian, well, we do, but we have memory, you know, and it lives within us. We know our story, you know, but just knowing it doesn't make it so for the rest of America, I think, or for the rest of the world. You know, they have to see it, and in ways that the way that Lynn has portrayed this story is really pretty undeniable. And when people see it in an undeniable fashion like that, maybe they're gonna believe more. I don't know. I hope so.
You know, Evelyn, it's a great question, and it's so great to see you, my former colleague from the University of Colorado, when we were together. Look, this is not a simple question. This is a deeply complicated question. There's a technical aspect to it, which goes to the archive. You know, the records of African-American slavery are, you know, rich and dense compared to the records of Indigenous slavery. Everyone who's ever worked on Indigenous slavery has pointed this out repeatedly. So there's a technical question about the archive. There is, I think, a sort of racial formation question in American culture writ large, which is to say the African-American story and the Native American story are oftentimes siloed. There are ways to tell these kinds of stories. One is a story of engagement and complication and certain forms of guilt. Another is a story of disengagement and distance and other kinds of guilt. You know, I mean, there is a practice, American cultural practice of sort of like, you know, hit me quickly and hard with this Native story. I'm going to feel super guilty about it, and then I'm going to move on. You know, so the first, you know, displays at the National Museum of the American Indian were full of "We are still here," right? This is what these things were all about. It was a Native voice speaking, saying we're still here. What did we hear from the first audience surveys? Tell us how bad it was so that we can feel a little bit of white guilt and then put it behind us and move on, right? So there's those kinds of things. There's the repulsion and you know, and attraction kind of element. There's the settler colonial erasure thing. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to think about it. They all kind of collide and go together. So I think, you know, I mean, I'm not gonna say any more because like there's no point in parsing this out, you know, kind of bit by bit, but it's just this complicated thing and it is totally with us, right? And I think probably will always be despite our wonderful books.
I agree. Yeah.
We are metaphorically still like your teacher. We are still in total denying and trying to deny it the whole public. And it has to be spotlighted You know, just the way the natives were recategorized as blacks. There's a huge denial over hundreds of years. The public is still like your teacher, and that is the basic problem. So it's just a start.
I don't know who was right, but go ahead.
Is it work? Oh, yeah. And thank you for your nice work. After watching it, I find that this is identical to what happens in the Spanish invasion in Mexico and other regions in Latin America. Regarding the issue of why this memory has been vanished, I believe that there will be two answers can be added. One is some kind of issue of who controls the both documents and even access to the documents in the name of bureaucracy and nation building. And second one is language barrier, I believe. Since the documents you make the analysis of some kind of governmental documents or even some company documents as well, and even the reports or registration. So as we saw, they are basically the documents are restricted. Yeah? Even the bureaucratic, some kind of conventions like the use of abbreviations or use of just only some alternate terms like not the enslavement, but just hiring some person like may prevent all the documents from access of the public into the idea. Even the fact that the physical document has been hidden in the archives and anywhere may also make the problem more serious. Also some kind of language barrier like the writings in some kind of bureaucratic English. We have no chance to give me access to not just only typical American populace, but also the indigenous population, even the foreigners like Koreans like me. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. There's multiple layers here, I think, as Phil was saying. That's,
So this is a somewhat different way that I have thought about erasure. In work that I've done on the boarding schools, one of the things I hear is that many families dealt with the boarding school trauma by never talking about it. And that's something that it's not unique to that situation. World War I veterans came home and didn't talk about the mustard gas. Vietnam veterans don't talk about Vietnam. Holocaust survivors often did not want to talk about. That's not what they told their children about. Rape survivors do not spend a lot of time telling everybody about their rape. And so part of the erasure is people having the right not to display their pain, particularly not to people they don't trust, namely white settler people. So I think I see some erasures as signs of agency and as communities holding knowledge among the people they trust. And I wondered in your research, as you're doing this, both in the Stolen Relations Project and for the book, did you run into that kind of resistance of people saying, we want to focus on today, on the community that is here, that is reconnecting, on making sure our children know the dances and the language, and we don't really want to talk about the past traumas? Or did you run into resistance with them looking at you like, who are you? Why should we tell you? We'll tell our people, but why should we tell you?
Yeah, very quickly, I would say everyone has been immensely gracious, and people I've talked to, and also there's been a desire almost universally to have these histories, for the most part, be sort of out there and understood. Especially with stolen relations, we had those conversations about what should be public, what should be out there, and I will say that what has been most helpful is sort of having had them take us by the lapels, so to speak, sometimes, and slowing us down and thinking differently about sort of the documents, the stories they tell, and to just not rush them out to the public, but to process them first in a way. And so, but I'm trying to think of, and maybe feel free to jump in, but overall, I was really grateful that people are like, the story needs to be told. And most of this stuff is right in the archives. It's not like I'm drawing upon vast reservoirs of secret community knowledge. It's been, the consultation has been really amazing and supportive and helpful, but it's kind of just right there. Yeah.
Well, I think that, Lynn, you earned that trust by approaching it in the way that you did and allowing us, because I also worked on stolen relations. I forget where I am sometimes, yeah. And just the patience and the listening and the letting us know that this is our story and we'll tell it in our voice, and trusting him to interpret that for us in the book as well. I mean, it has to do with who he is. There are a lot of people that we tell to go pound sand. I'm not gonna talk to you, and I don't care what you think you know or you don't know, but yeah, that's where it comes from.
We have time for maybe one more, if there's something else. If not, I know that we're keeping you from all the goodies, so.
Thank you for this. I was wondering how the term emancipation shows up in your story. Does it vary across communities? How does it, is it co-created? Is it over time? How does it show up in your story?
Yeah, the term that sort of not just we, but we adopted for stolen relations, and I think reflected in the book as well, it's mostly used in terms of self-emancipation, like sort of runaway slave ads and that kind of context. There's not sort of these moments of, I mean, I use it where you would expect it, right? So like 1834, 1863 or something like that, right? But this is a story that, generally speaking, when there is freedom that is gained, it's fought through the courts and law, and there's only really a couple times. One of them is in British Honduras or Belize in the 1820s, where there's sort of what you might call a mass emancipation of enslaved indigenous people. And even that has to sort of work its way through the system and involves the commissioners of legal inquiry being diverted from Bermuda to come down to Belize to be like, what's going on here? So emancipation feels like, I mean, this is just thinking on the fly, like why I didn't use it that much. It just doesn't feel like it represents the sort of processes from the ground up of people who sort of find their way to secure their freedom. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but yeah. So I think we're gonna call the question. We're over time by quite a lot. I would ask you to sort of keep the questions flowing over the cake and everything else. So thanks so much.
So very, very briefly before we applaud our friends here, just noting that our friends at Symposium Books have Lynn's books here. As Lynn noted, he's got material for the benefit of the Tomahawk. There is going to be unprecedented cake as well as our usual libations here. So join me in thanking our friends, especially Lynn, and then we will enjoy further conversation.